Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Tekippe Lecture. In 2007, Notre Dame Seminary formally dedicated its annual fall lecture series to the late Monsignor Terry Tekippe, a beloved seminary professor and priest of the Archdiocese of New Orleans, who died unexpectedly in the summer of 2005 while vacationing in Greece. The annual Tekippe Theological Forum lecture affords Notre Dame Seminary the opportunity to expose the seminary community to nationally and internationally known theologians and scholars who speak on a diverse range of topics with relevance to contemporary events in the church and the world. Tonight, I'm pleased to announce our presenter, Dr. Nathan Mastanjak, joined the faculty of Notre Dame Seminary in 2019 as a professor of sacred scripture. He's previously taught at Indiana University and Brandeis University and was a Harry Starr Fellow in Judaica at Harvard University. Dr. Mastanjak received his PhD in Hebrew Bible and the Ancient Near East from the University of Chicago in 2015. His research and writing focuses on the prophetic literature of the Old Testament. His first book, Deuteronomy and the Emergence of Textual Authority in Jeremiah, was published in 2016 by Moore Zebek. His second book, The Scrolls of the Prophets, is currently in preparation. Dr. Mastanjak has also published a number of articles in scholarly journals. I would like now for you to join me in welcoming Dr. Nathan Mastanjak.
Thank you, Dr. Maloney, for the introduction. And I want to also thank the faculty and our rector for the invitation to speak tonight. It's truly an honor to be giving the Tekippe Lecture this evening. Today, I would like to speak about the manuscript history of the Book of Ezekiel and its importance for understanding a particular theological trajectory within that book. Only rarely, I think, do we really consider the material history of biblical books. But when we do turn our attention to that history, we often find that the scribes responsible for transmitting sacred scripture are themselves readers and interpreters of it. By attending to the ways these scribes interpreted the works that they handed on, we can, in some cases, see what features of the text they found particularly salient. What the scribes found particularly salient then gives us snapshots of the history of the book as a part of a broader divine pedagogy. As we will see, in the case of Ezekiel, the manuscript history directs particular attention to Ezekiel's understanding of the divine spirit and its role in the economy of redemption. Among the prophets, Ezekiel is not alone in developing notions of a future spirit-induced renewal of God's people. And yet, his development of this idea and its relation to Ezekiel's own prophetic experience bring it into especially clear focus. The book, in fact, represents a key moment in the development of expectations for the realities later to be experienced by the apostles on Pentecost, the pouring out of the Holy Spirit on the people of God. And as we'll see, Ezekiel 36, verses 23 to 38, is a passage that both has a particularly interesting textual history and contains an important synthesis of Ezekiel's theology of the Spirit. Looking at that passage in light of the book as a whole will give us insight into what we might call a manuscript biography of the book of Ezekiel and the inner development of Ezekiel's theology of the Spirit. Since the manuscript history of Ezekiel will play a role in my discussion of Ezekiel's theology of the Spirit, I'd like to begin with a survey of the history of the book of Ezekiel with a particular eye on its material nature. Its origins are in the 6th century BC, and through human effort and divine providence, it has persisted to the present day. Needless to say, the material forms in which we encounter the book of Ezekiel today differ significantly from the forms in which it was written and read for the first several centuries of its life. If we ask about the material origins of Ezekiel, we immediately run into a problem. We simply don't have any actual artifact evidence for Ezekiel or any other lengthy Judean literary work from anywhere near its time of composition. When speaking of the origins of Ezekiel, therefore, we are in the realm of deduction and educated guess rather than direct evidence. Before we enter those murky waters, I'd like to turn to the earliest artifact evidence that we do have, which comes several centuries after its composition in the scrolls from the Dead Sea. Here's the evidence, and it's pretty meager. These fragments are all written on parchment, that is, a writing material prepared from animal skins, and they all were almost certainly part of scrolls. Taken together, they amount to a total of just 340 words, which is about the equivalent of a single page of typed double-spaced text. Just to get an idea of what we're working with, here we have an image of two of the manuscripts of Ezekiel. The group of fragments on the top are called 4Q74. The tiny scrap on the bottom is 4Q75. The scale shows that 4Q75 is not much more than 1 square centimeter. And that's it. That's the entire manuscript. If they ever find a way of opening or maybe x-raying 11Q4, we'll be in a much better shape. But until then, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't give us much of the actual text of Ezekiel, unfortunately. Nevertheless, we do have a fairly good idea of the general scribal practice at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, roughly the 2nd century BC through the 1st century AD. We can extrapolate from this a general idea of what a complete Ezekiel scroll of that time would have looked like. While we don't have much to go on for Ezekiel, we are in much better shape when it comes to another prophetic scroll, the Book of Isaiah. Here's an image of the great Isaiah scroll entirely unrolled. This manuscript is dated to about 125 BC and is nearly complete. It's about 7.34 meters long, which is about 24 feet. And here's a closer up image of the manuscript that allows you to see some of the columns and some of the damage, which compared to the majority of the Dead Sea Scrolls is actually relatively minor. So, around the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can posit that Ezekiel would have looked more or less like this Isaiah scroll. The entire book written on a single scroll of parchment. This gives us a picture of Jewish scribal culture in the last 2 centuries or so of the Second Temple period. The problem is that this provides us with evidence for Ezekiel from a time when the book was whereas the book was written for the most part in the 6th century BC, the oldest fragments we have date some 5 centuries later, to the 1st century BC. And the social and cultural conditions of Hellenistic Judea in the 1st century BC are vastly different than those of the exilic community in the 6th century Babylon and the early post-exilic Yehud. We simply cannot just anachronistically project a later Hellenistic Jewish scribal culture back half a millennium into the past, although scholars sometimes try to do this. If we are to venture an explanation of the material form of Ezekiel at the time of its composition, we need to gather what clues we can to develop a plausible hypothesis. There are 2 types of evidence that allow us to have some idea of this early material history. The first are references within biblical texts to their own material nature. The second is material culture itself, by which I mean artifacts from the relevant periods. While we do not have any artifacts of biblical texts that are contemporary to the writing of the majority of the Old Testament corpus, we do have other material remains that give insight into the scribal cultures that produced works like Ezekiel. When we look at this data, what we'll find is first, that in the earliest periods of biblical composition, papyrus, not parchment, was most likely the primary medium of textual production and preservation. And second, these papyrus scrolls were on average shorter than the long-form parchment scrolls we find hundreds of years later at the Dead Sea. One of the consequences of these observations is that many books that we think of as single volumes would have likely been comprised of multiple volumes of shorter papyrus scrolls in the earlier periods. Turning now to some of the data that leads to these conclusions, we can look first at scattered hints within the biblical text itself. Within Ezekiel, there's not a lot to go on, but Jeremiah contains a number of references that are at least modestly helpful. Jeremiah 36 is unique in describing the writing of a prophetic scroll, and as such contains important hints concerning the materiality of prophetic literature at the time of the composition of Jeremiah, which is roughly contemporary to the composition of Ezekiel. Menachem Haran, a scholar who has done significant work on this topic, highlights two features of Jeremiah 36 that seem to indicate the scroll described there was made of papyrus and not parchment. First, according to the narrative, the scroll was destroyed by burning. As Haran points out, papyrus is highly flammable, but parchment is less so. Throwing bits of papyrus on a fire, and they'll immediately ignite. Parchment will not. Second, prior to being burned, it says the scroll was cut up column by column with a knife, a standard tool in the kit of Egyptian scribes who worked almost exclusively with papyrus, from which pieces could be cut as needed for use. And here we also have an image of an Egyptian scribal knife. Parchment scrolls were not prepared or cut in this way. Other narratives in Jeremiah contain similar hints. More significant than these scattered literary hints is artifact evidence. While, as I said, we don't have any material remains of extended Israelite literary works from either the monarchic, exilic, or early post-exilic periods, we do have evidence for archival documents from those periods, and all the evidence we have points to papyrus as a preferred material for scribal production. From the monarchic period, we have a single manuscript, a small letter, which is written on papyrus. In addition, we have numerous bullae, which are small pieces of clay used to seal scrolls, often with a stamp seal impression on one side. And here's an example. On the other side of the seal impression, the imprint of papyrus fibers are often visible, proving the widespread use of papyrus in both Israel and Judah in the monarchic period. The source of much or most of the papyrus used in Israel during these periods was likely Egypt. Since at least the 11th century BC, Egypt both cultivated papyrus and exported it as a valuable commodity around the Mediterranean. That Egyptian influence is notable throughout the history of Israel and Judah, particularly in its scribal practices. And here I quote, until the first centuries of the Common Era, papyri in Egypt and other lands where papyrus was used for writing were much less expensive and more easily procurable than parchment. Further material evidence from a variety of archives shows that the monarchic preference for papyrus persisted throughout the Persian period. If we put all of this material evidence together with the internal clues for papyrus, we can conclude that the most probable material form for the composition of the vast majority of Old Testament literature, including Ezekiel, was the papyrus scroll. At some point, probably in the Hellenistic period, the preference shifted to parchment, the practice we see in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, you may be wondering at this point, what in the world does it matter? Whether Ezekiel was originally written on papyrus or parchment. A scroll is a scroll, you might say, whether on papyrus or animal skin. You might think so, but in fact, there were marked differences between the production of papyrus scrolls and the parchment scrolls known from the Dead Sea. And these differences imply differences of format for literary works of length like Ezekiel. Whereas the Dead Sea Scrolls attest a preference for long parchment scrolls, evidence suggests that earlier papyrus scrolls would by and large have been much shorter for reasons of both ease of use and the durability of the materials. From the New Kingdom Egypt on, that is from the 16th century BC on, through to the Roman period, the average papyrus roll was about 3.4 to 4 meters long. If you recall, the Great Isaiah Scroll is about 7.34 meters. Dead Sea Scrolls of Jeremiah are reconstructed at a range from about 7.9 meters to a truly impressive deluxe edition of about 17 meters, which is around 56 feet long. Scrolls of Ezekiel are reconstructed at around 6 meters, up to a seemingly impossible 32 meters long. All of these parchment works exceed the average papyrus scroll length of 3.4 to 4 meters, and this strongly suggests that it would have been unlikely for any of them to have been written on a single papyrus scroll. Using sources now lost to us, the 12th century Byzantine scholar John Tzetzes describes the holdings of the famous Hellenistic library of Alexandria. The library, according to his sources, contained 400,000 mixed sumiges and 90,000 unmixed omiges scrolls. The meaning of mixed versus unmixed here is debated, but it seems likely that mixed refers to scrolls that are part of a larger multi-scroll work, and unmixed refers to scrolls, to works that were coterminous with a single scroll. The practice represented here reflects a literary culture in which many works were longer than could be comfortably contained on the average scroll. Though it was technically possible to produce longer scrolls, this was a culture that, for largely practical reasons, preferred to keep the length of scrolls relatively short and opt instead for multi-volume works. Longer papyrus scrolls did exist, but they were restricted for the most part to works that are not actually intended to be used. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, for instance, is sometimes an incredibly long scroll, upwards of 40 meters, and a papyrus scroll of up to 40 meters. But its only audience is the gods and the spirits of the dead, for whom such unwieldy scrolls are no barrier. The living prefer scrolls of more manageable size. What can we glean from all of this? The major prophetic books of the Old Testament, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel, were produced in a scribal culture with a preference for short papyrus scrolls. Our best guess for the earliest material form of one of these prophetic books, therefore, is a multi-volume collection. The earliest book of Ezekiel, therefore, was most likely a multi-volume work, a collection of texts associated with a prophet rather than a single scroll with a rigid beginning, middle, and end. Later, perhaps first in the Hellenistic period, this collection was copied onto long parchment scrolls that can accommodate the entire collection. So far, we've discussed the earliest manuscript evidence for Ezekiel and the fragmentary scraps of parchment. We've discussed the earliest evidence, which is the fragmentary scraps of parchment from the Dead Sea, and we've also discussed the likely earlier material form as a collection of shorter papyrus scrolls. What I'd like to move to now is the first nearly complete manuscript of Ezekiel that the accidents of history has made available to us, which is a Greek manuscript called Papyrus 967. While perhaps not the best known or sensational of the manuscript discoveries of the 20th century, it is nevertheless a highly significant document that potentially changes the way we view the composition of the Book of Ezekiel. It was discovered in Egypt in the 1930s, most likely in the ruins of an early Christian church or monastery. Here's a picture of a page of it. The Book of Ezekiel here is part of a codex, not a scroll, a codex that contains Ezekiel and several other Old Testament books, although not by any means the entire Old Testament. It dates to the early 3rd century. Given its codex form, as well as its practice of abbreviating the divine names Theos, Kurios, and even Pneuma, it is almost certainly a Christian manuscript. It's kind of interesting when you think about it. Our earliest nearly complete manuscript of Ezekiel is Christian. Now, just for fun, here's a close-up of a passage where the abbreviations can be seen. I've circled them in red. Kurios ha Theos and Pneuma ti Kuriou, Spirit of the Lord. These abbreviations, as well as the use of the codex, are a peculiar scribal practice attested only in Christian manuscripts. And the abbreviations appear only for divine names, including for New Testament texts, Jesus and Christ, etc. As far as we know, Jewish scribes never did this. And it's particularly fascinating to see our scribe treating Pneuma, Spirit, as a divine name. It's tempting to read a kind of Trinitarianism into the treatment of Pneuma here and elsewhere in this particular manuscript. Papyrus 967 is significant, not the complete book of Ezekiel, but also because it contains significant textual variants that distinguish it from both the Masoretic text and the Septuagint. We're going to continue thinking about Papyrus 967, but to continue our brief biography of the book of Ezekiel, the next oldest manuscripts we have are the 4th century manuscripts of the Septuagint. So just for comparison, here's a page of the Sinaiticus Codex. Now, when speaking of the Septuagint, we can quickly run into terminological imprecision and confusion. Often we use the term Septuagint as shorthand to refer simply to the singular Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, we often distinguish the Septuagint from later revisions of it, especially the revisions known as Aquila, Symmachus, and Theodotion. The problem is that the first manuscripts we have of this base text of the Septuagint have, in some cases, already undergone revision. For this reason, we sometimes need to distinguish between the Septuagint and what we call the Old Greek. The Septuagint, then, is a witness to the Old Greek, but certain manuscripts may differ in larger or smaller ways from it. This is important for our present discussion because the Septuagint version of Ezekiel is significantly different from the version we find in Papyrus 967. There are a number of ways of explaining these differences, but the most likely is that Papyrus 967 and the Septuagint have a common Greek ancestor, and both have been corrected towards a Hebrew text. The Septuagint version is much, much closer to what we might call the Proto-Masoretic text, the text that will become the Hebrew text that we use today. And this suggests that the Papyrus 967 represents a closer witness to the Old Greek than the Septuagint version of Ezekiel, which again has been revised toward the Proto-Masoretic Hebrew version. To kind of complete this picture, our direct witnesses to the Hebrew version, which we call the Masoretic text, and which serves as a base text for our contemporary translations of the Old Testament, are from medieval manuscripts of the 10th and 11th century. So here's a page from the famous Leningrad Codex. I've left out quite a bit here, but what I've sketched so far gives you a basic idea of the manuscript history of Ezekiel from the time of its composition up to the medieval Hebrew manuscripts that serve as a basis for modern translations. This chart summarizes the history of the book that we've so far traced. With this history in mind, I'd like to return to our oldest nearly complete manuscript, Papyrus 967, as our best witness to the Old Greek. Papyrus 967 contains all the usual types of textual variants that one expects to find. Minor variants of a word or phrase here or there, arising partly from scribal error and partly from scribal clarification, appear here and are the norm. But beyond these, Papyrus 967 also contains some variants that are much bigger and far more significant than what we usually see, although these are also not without precedent. Most strikingly, the order of chapters in this book is different than the version attested by the Masoretic text and Septuagint. In both versions, chapters 1 to 36 begin the book, and Papyrus 967, chapter 36, is followed immediately by the Gog oracle, which is chapters 38 to 39 in the Masoretic text. It is then followed by the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, and an oracle and sign act relating to the future kingdom of Israel, chapter 37 in the Masoretic text. Papyrus 967 then continues with the vision of the Second Temple, chapters 40 to 48. So here's the two versions, the two arrangements of the book side by side, obviously using the Masoretic text versification and chapter numbers so you can compare them easily. So the first major variant is a variant in order. The second, equally interesting large-scale variant is chapter 36, 23c to 38, a significant chunk of text starting at the end of verse 23 and running to the end of the chapter. This entire passage is present in the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, but not present at all in Papyrus 967. I'll be referring to this passage and what follows as the plus, which is simply what text critics tend to call a passage that appears in one text, but is absent from another. These remarkable variants, both the absence of the plus and the order of chapters, show up in a few isolated later manuscripts, including a 6th century Latin codex. And in fact, the Old Greek version attested in Papyrus 967 seems to be the basis of the Old Latin translation of Ezekiel. There's another small piece of evidence to this emerging puzzle. 10 years prior to the discovery of Papyrus 967, H.J. Thackeray, an eminent Septuagint scholar, recognized that something was up with this very passage. His research into the translation technique of the Septuagint of Ezekiel led him to conclude that the book had, for the most part, two translators with distinctive translation techniques and habits. Thackeray noticed, however, that there is something strange in this particular plus, and he in fact posits a third translator restricted to Ezekiel 36, 24 to 38. And again, it's important to recognize that he posits this before it was known to the scholarly community that this was a plus in the Masoretic text / Septuagint. So he points out that otherwise formulaic expressions for which both the translators of Ezekiel had their own standard formulations were suddenly rendered differently. Most notably is the treatment of the distinctive divine name used in Ezekiel. The Hebrew text reads Adonai Yahweh, the Lord Yahweh. Translator 1 translates this sometimes simply as Kurios, Lord, the standard Septuagintal rendering of Yahweh, and sometimes Kurios Hatheos, the Lord God. Translator 2 usually has Kurios Kurios, Lord Lord. Only in Ezekiel 36, 24 to 38 do we suddenly find a transliterated rendering, Adonai Kurios. This is a feature of the Theodosian revision of the Septuagint. And the translation of the passage in the Septuagint of Ezekiel here seems to be influenced by that translation or come from the same school. Thackeray also notes that on close inspection, even the Hebrew version of this passage contains lexical peculiarities that set it apart from the rest of the book. First, everywhere else in Ezekiel, the first-person subject pronoun appears as ani. Only in Ezekiel 36, 23c to 38, is the alternate form anoki used. Second, this passage contains in verse 35 a unique feminine demonstrative pronoun, halazu, that occurs nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. So both the Septuagint translation and the Hebrew itself suggest that something was up with this particular passage. These phenomena call out for some kind of explanation. I think the most likely scenario is as follows. Papyrus 967 gives us a close approximation of the Old Greek, that is, the original translation of a Hebrew book of Ezekiel, a Hebrew book of Ezekiel. Notice that I said a Hebrew book, not the Hebrew book. Keep that in mind. The absence of 36:23c to 38 from Papyrus 967 cannot be explained as a scribal error, nor can it be explained, I think, as a deliberate scribal omission. We will look at the content of this passage in a few minutes, but here we see nothing that might prompt a scribe or translator to abbreviate or remove it. The most likely explanation is that the Hebrew base text for the Old Greek translation simply lacked this passage. The Hebrew of the Masoretic version, however, does have the passage, and this means there were multiple Hebrew versions of Ezekiel in circulation. As surprising as this might initially sound, there are other examples of multiple versions of biblical books. Jeremiah is a prominent example where, like Ezekiel, the Masoretic text is longer, significantly longer in the case of Jeremiah, than the Septuagint, and contains a different order of chapters. But unlike Jeremiah, by the time we get to the Greek manuscripts of the 4th century, the Septuagintal version of Ezekiel had already been revised toward the Proto-Masoretic text. This is why the Septuagint contains Ezekiel 36, 23c to 38, but by the hand of a different translator. The Old Greek, which witnessed to a shorter Hebrew text, didn't have it, and so in revising the Septuagint to greater conformity to the Proto-Masoretic text, another translation was used to fill in the substantial gap. This explanation suggests that 36:23c to 38 was not part of the earliest form of the book of Ezekiel, but represents a later edition. This leaves at least two further questions that need to be asked and answered. First, how do you explain the differing orders of the two versions of Ezekiel? Second, what is the motivation for the Proto-Masoretic text to add this passage in chapter 36? In general, when faced with these kinds of questions, proposing an explanation requires positing some kind of theory explaining which version was original and why the other version changed that original. In this case, if you posit that Papyrus 967 reflects an older form of the book that is closer to the original, you would have to explain why the Masoretic text added a lengthy section in chapter 36 and rearrange the following chapters. If conversely you posit that the Masoretic text represents the original or a more original form of the book, you'd have to explain why Papyrus 967, or rather, really what I'm speaking of, its Hebrew forlaga, saw fit to change the order and remove the large section in 36. So this is how the problem is generally approached, and scholars have provided arguments in both directions. But by framing the problem in this particular way, which is original and which is secondary, the modern scholarly discussion of this problem has assumed rather than proved that one order of the book had to be original and the other had to be a deliberate modification. The problem is that it is very difficult to find a reason why a scribe would engage in such a high-handed textual intervention. When we examine the scholarly assumption of an original text, we can find embedded in it a suspect assumption about the materiality of the Ezekiel scroll. Scholars have assumed that from its beginning, the Book of Ezekiel had always been a single book scroll. Only if it was a long-form book scroll with a materially determined sequence, safely assumed that there had to be an original order. The glaring problem is what we discussed in the first part of this lecture. All things being equal, our best assumption for the materiality of the Book of Ezekiel in the exilic and early post-exilic periods is not a single scroll at all, but multiple scrolls. Once the possibility of a multi-volume work is allowed, the otherwise vexing problem of the multiple orders of the book becomes less puzzling, and the supposed necessity of determining which order is original and which is secondary disappears. I propose that originally the book was not a book per se at all, but a collection of scrolls and sheets. My explanation for the differing orders of the Proto-Masoretic text and Papyrus 967, then, is that they are, in a sense, both original efforts at transforming a collection into a book. In my survey of scholarship on the question, I was impressed both by the beautiful arguments that scholars made for the originality of each version and for the comparatively feeble arguments that they made for the secondary nature of the other version. Scholarly arguments went both ways, some arguing for the priority of Papyrus 967, others for the priority of the Proto-Masoretic text. My admittedly not so modest proposal is that everyone is wrong. But everyone is wrong, in a sense, right. Both books are original, but neither is a modification of the other. If we are to imagine this Ezekiel collection in the Persian period, therefore, I would suggest that perhaps one scroll was chapters 1 to 36, ending in 3623b, another was chapters 40 to 48, another was chapters 36 to 39, and another was chapter 37. Working with this Ezekiel archive, the Proto-Masoretic text, and the Forlaga of the Old Greek independently produced different long-form books of Ezekiel. The system of dates in Ezekiel didn't leave much room for variation. Chapters 1 to 36 had to go at the beginning, chapters 40 to 48 had to go at the end, and each version simply had their own reasons for arranging the other two pieces, and neither has to be seen as deliberately or high-handedly altering an otherwise fixed original order of materials, because there was none. Positing a multi-volume Ezekiel collection might solve the problem of the variant orders of the book, but what about the substantial plus in Ezekiel 36? As we turn to this issue, the first thing to notice is that this variant occurs at precisely the point in the book where the variation in order first appears. That is, the transition from chapter 36 to whatever comes next. What this suggests is that the great plus in chapter 36 was introduced precisely as part of the bookmaking activity that transformed the Ezekiel collection into the Proto-Masoretic Book of Ezekiel. Several features of the content of this plus corroborate this suggestion. To understand the role this plus plays in the Proto-Masoretic Book of Ezekiel, we need to turn our attention to its particular place in the theology of the book, and specifically in Ezekiel's development of a theology of the divine spirit. What we find in Ezekiel is not, of course, a fully fledged Trinitarian theology or a complete description of the role of the Holy Spirit in the economy of redemption. Nevertheless, Ezekiel plays a critical role in preparing for the ultimate unveiling of these truths. Given what I've said about the textual history of the book, it is striking that Ezekiel's theology of the Spirit is articulated in particular ways in the first part of the book, chapters 1 through 36, 23b, and these ideas are modified and developed in particular ways in chapters 37 to 39. In other words, what I've described as originally separate scrolls of the Ezekiel collection appear to have uniquely articulated ideas about the divine spirit. And these ideas are given a climactic synthesis in the plus in chapter 36, suggesting that this plus was composed precisely in order to give the newly created book of Ezekiel a thematic unity centered on the divine spirit. So to begin with the theology of the Spirit in chapters 1 through 36, 23b, the most explicit and pervasive references to the working of the divine spirit, the Ruach Adonai, the Ruach Yahweh, center on the empowerment of the prophet himself. Ezekiel 1 concludes with the succinct description of the effect of the overwhelming vision of divine glory on the prophet. It was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of Yahweh. I saw and I fell upon my face. So devastating was this experience that the prophetic counter can only continue with the empowerment of a spirit. Then I heard a voice speaking. It said to me, "Son of man, stand on your feet that I may speak with you." And when he spoke to me, a spirit entered into me and it made me stand upon my feet. Then I listened to the one speaking to me. This conjunction of the possession by a spirit and prophecy is not unique to Ezekiel. It appears, for example, in Numbers 11, multiple times in the book of Samuel, and also elsewhere throughout the Old Testament. In the prophetic books, however, this notion of prophecy operating on the basis of an investure with the Spirit is particularly developed here in the book of Ezekiel. This Spirit appears repeatedly in descriptions of Ezekiel's visions and prophetic utterances. It appears repeatedly and also doing a variety of things to and with Ezekiel. There's a variety of phenomena described here, but looking at each of these, we can see that for Ezekiel, the experience of prophecy was not merely audible or just a still small voice, but rather involves a bodily encounter with the divine presence, the glory of God, an experience so overwhelming that the empowerment by Yahweh's own Spirit is necessary to withstand it. A parallel thread in this first part of the book surrounds an internal change in the people. Ezekiel 11, 14 to 20, addresses the Judeans in exile and anticipates a future restoration. Verse 19 to 20a state, "I will give them a single heart and a new spirit, Ruach, I will set in their midst. And I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh, in order that they may walk in my statutes and keep my judgments and do them." This restoration will involve a divinely initiated transformation that will enable obedience to divine law. The same concept is included as part of a threat at the residents of Judah in 1831. "Cast out all your sins in which you have sinned and get yourself a new heart and a new spirit. Why should you die, O house of Israel?" In these two passages, Ezekiel is speaking of an inner transformation. We have to ask what he means by the two operative terms, heart and spirit. In biblical Hebrew, the heart, lev or levav, is the seat of all operations of human interiority. It is the heart that feels emotions, yes, that corresponds to how we tend to speak of the heart, but it's also the heart that thinks, understands, remembers, wills, intends. It's the heart that can turn to or from God. To envision a new heart, therefore, is to anticipate a thorough transformation of the inner human. In contemplating the need for this transformation, Ezekiel draws on and extends ideas that are by his time already traditional. In its call to the people to obedience, Deuteronomy 10:16 commands the people to, quote, "circumcise the foreskin of your heart and show yourselves no longer stubborn." Implicit in this command is the recognition that Israel's problem, and by implication humanity's problem, is a problem of the heart, a defect in the inner man, which must be removed before obedience is possible. This inner defect is hinted also in Deuteronomy 5:29. After the theophany and revelation of the Ten Commandments on Sinai, the people respond with godly fear and a commitment to obey. Yahweh approves of their response and responds himself almost wistfully, if only they would have this heart to fear me and keep my commandments. That's Deuteronomy 5:29. The rhetorical structure expresses a counterfactual wish. Yahweh knows full well that they will not always have the heart they had on the day of the Sinai theophany. The problem is the human heart. And Deuteronomy reads the bloody ritual of circumcision as an allegory for a deeper cutting away of the inner impediment to obedience. Subsequent prophetic reflection will come to the conclusion that this inner transformation will require divine initiative. In Jeremiah 32:39, for example, Yahweh promises to give, quote, a single heart in a single way in order to fear me all the days, for their good and their sons after them. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, part of what I would consider a late addition to Deuteronomy, in fact, likely influenced by Jeremiah, articulates a similar idea. Yahweh your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your offspring in order to love Yahweh your God with your whole heart and your whole soul that you might live. Where there was earlier in Deuteronomy a call for Israel to circumcise their own hearts, here we have a recognition that this interchange is only possible if Yahweh himself performs the circumcision. Where there was earlier a call for Israel to circumcise themselves, the bitter experience of exile taught the prophets to recognize that only God could accomplish this transformation. The prophets here begin to see clearly the necessity and the promise of the grace of regeneration. If anything, Ezekiel's language of a new heart of flesh in place of a heart of stone ups the metaphorical ante, whereas Deuteronomy sticks with the language of circumcision, a cutting away of the barrier to obedience, a heart surgery, if you will. Ezekiel calls for an even more radical surgical intervention, not merely a removal of a piece, as in circumcision, but an entire heart transplant, an entirely new heart, a complete remaking of the inner man. Only then will obedience become a possibility for the people. But what of his language of new spirit? The Hebrew word ruach has a broad semantic range. On the one hand, in Ezekiel's own prophetic experience, we have seen the divine spirit as the force that possesses Ezekiel and enables him to converse with Yahweh. But elsewhere in Ezekiel and the Old Testament, ruach is also clearly used as an anthropological category, referring, like heart, to human interiority. In Ezekiel 20, verse 32, for example, it simply refers to the human mind. That which has come upon your ruach, mind, will certainly not come about. Or consider Psalm 51, verse 10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew an upright spirit within me. There, the two terms, heart and spirit, used in poetic parallelism. The similar pairing of spirit and heart in Ezekiel 11:19 and 18:31 confirms, I think, that spirit in these contexts is similarly an anthropological category, another way of referring to the inner human in need of renewal. The adjuration to make yourself a new heart and a new spirit in 18:31 is joined with the adjuration to repent. The only way to avoid the coming judgment is to enact the needed transformation, an act that Ezekiel has already implied will only be possible at a future time and at divine initiative. Thus, we see in the first section of Ezekiel two notions of ruach, spirit, that do not quite intersect. One is central to the prophetic experience. The prophet cannot stand in the divine presence without an empowerment by the Spirit of God himself. The other is central to Ezekiel's particular way of pointing quite directly to the necessity of the grace of regeneration. The fundamental problem of the Mosaic covenant is a defect deep within the human heart and spirit, and on that day, that eschatological day when things are finally set right, God himself will give a new heart and a new spirit within his people that they will finally be able to obey him. Bracketing out for the moment the substantial plus in Ezekiel 36, we see a development of the Ruach theology in chapters 37 to 39, which again I've suggested should be considered originally separate scrolls within the earlier Ezekiel collection. In different ways, both chapters 38 to 39 on the one hand and chapter 37 on the other take up the theme of spiritual renewal of the people of God and extend it in a remarkable way. In chapter 37, Ezekiel sees a vision that depicts the exiled people of Israel as scattered bones. In the metaphorical world of this vision, exile is death, and the exiled body is worse than a corpse. It's unburied and undifferentiated bones. At the prophetic word, however, the bones put on flesh and are finally vivified through the inhalation of the divine ruach. I will set my ruach, spirit, in you, and you will live, and I will place you in your land, and you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken, and I will act, declares Yahweh. Ezekiel 37:14. Ezekiel 39:29 again refers to a future impartation to the people of the divine ruach. I will not hide my face from you anymore when I pour out my ruach upon the house of Israel, declares the Lord Yahweh. In these passages, the ruach of Yahweh is described as entering the people and empowering them, analogously to the ruach possession described of Ezekiel himself in chapters 1 to 36. The analogy finds expression especially in the valley of dry bones, where the vivifying of the bones occurs through the mediation of the ruach-endowed prophet. The language used for this revivification is reminiscent of the prophet's own ruach-enabled ability to withstand the divine encounter. Twice in the first part of the book, the divine presence causes Ezekiel to collapse. Each time it is the ruach possession that enables him to rise. A ruach entered me, vatavo bi ruach, and stood me on my feet, va ta'amideni al raglai. The vision of dry bones emphasizes the same effect of the divine ruach using the same words. The ruach entered them, vatavo bahem haruach, and they lived and they stood on their feet, va ya'amdu al raglehem. The author of Ezekiel 36 has built the idea of the people's spirit empowerment on an analogy to the prophet's own empowerment. In other words, it argues that the same divine ruach that empowers the prophet will empower the people as a whole. This represents a development and coordination of the two notions of spirit empowerment found in Ezekiel 1 through 36:23b. In that part of the book, the people were to receive a human spirit, whereas the prophet received a divine spirit. Here, the transformation of the people requires nothing less than the divine spirit itself. The idea is similar to what we find in Joel 3:1. After this, I will pour out my ruach on all flesh. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. A future outpouring of the divine ruach in Joel, as in Ezekiel 37, is a universalizing of prophetic ruach possession. Does this extension of the divine ruach to the people imply that they, like Ezekiel, will be able to stand in the presence of divine glory? It seems like it does. What is interesting is that Ezekiel 36 develops this notion in explicit reference to the prophetic ruach empowerment, but not with any explicit reference to the new heart and new spirit motif from Ezekiel 11, though it seems to be an unspoken background. With that in mind, we can finally turn to the content of Ezekiel 36, 23c to 38, which is centered, beginning to end, on the notion of the purification of Israel. If we read carefully, we'll immediately recognize very close verbal similarities to our new spirit passage from Ezekiel 11. 11:19, here in bold, reads, "And I will give them a single heart, and a new spirit I will put in their midst. And I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh." The near verbatim repetition in 36:26 is striking. "And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put in your midst, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh." It is clear that chapter 11 serves as a source for this plus in chapter 36. By placing the passages side by side, we can see that the parallels extend beyond these two verses. Both passages open with reference to the restoration from exile. "I will gather you from the peoples and bring you to the lands." Both move then into the need for purification. In Ezekiel 11:18, it is a purification of the land from idols accomplished by the returning exiles. And when they come there, they will remove all its detestable things and all of its abominations. The corresponding passage in 36:25 is thematically related, but moves in a different direction. It is the people themselves that have been defiled by idolatry and must be purified. Note well the baptismal language. "And I will sprinkle upon you pure water, and you will be purified from all your impurities, and I will purify you from all your idols. Connected directly to this purification in both cases, transformation of the people, the new heart and the new spirit. The function of Ezekiel 36, Ezekiel 36, the plus, as an interpretation of Ezekiel 11, comes into distinct perspective with what follows. Ezekiel 11 implies that the new spirit, like the new heart, is an anthropological category, a remaking of the inner human. Ezekiel 36:27a, by contrast, doubles down on the fact that the new spirit is, in fact, nothing less than the divine spirit. What were previously synonyms, the heart and spirit, are now two aspects of the transformation of humanity: a new human nature, the new heart, and the indwelling of the divine spirit. An entirely new mode of human existence is here anticipated. The remainder of this section develops this notion of purity and the resulting restoration of the land. Verse 29, I will save you from all your impurities. Verse 35, the land that was desolated by the conquest and exile will become like Eden itself. This plus, therefore, explicitly coordinates the spirit theology of chapter 37 with the new spirit, new heart promise of chapter 11. The plus, therefore, is both an interpretation and extension of Ezekiel 11 and a bridge to Ezekiel 36. It explicitly coordinates the theology of the divine Ruach that appears in these two sections of Ezekiel that I've argued should probably be thought of as two originally separate scrolls of the Ezekiel collection. We have two phenomena converging in these verses that are present in the Masoretic text but absent in the Old Greek. First, they appear at precisely the place where the arrangement of these two textual traditions diverges. And second, these verses provide a synthesis that combines the theology of spirit as expressed in chapters 1 to 36 with further developments of that theology in chapters 37 to 39. What this suggests is that the plus in Ezekiel 36 was composed expressly to provide a connection between these blocks of material. I have suggested that in the Babylonian and Persian periods, a work of the size of Ezekiel would have likely been written on multiple scrolls, more of a bookshelf or archive of Ezekiel materials than a book of Ezekiel per se. What all of this suggests is that this plus was composed as part of the transformation of the Ezekiel archive into the Proto-Masoretic book of Ezekiel. Now, I can't date this book making with any degree of certainty. The latest possible date is provided by the Masada scroll of Ezekiel, dated to the second half of the 1st century, which contains the plus in chapter 36, which is good. Beyond that, we're in the realm of probability and educated guesswork. My argument, as I hinted at before, is that that provides a likely context for the transition from short papyrus scrolls to the long-form parchment scrolls capable of easily accommodating works of length. In particular, political and economic realities surrounding the 2nd century transition of power from Ptolemaic to Seleucid rule in Palestine provide a plausible context for the transition. The chapter 36 plus is both an inspired and canonical part of Ezekiel and a window into an early reading of the Ezekiel tradition. It allows us a glimpse of a reader actively engaging with and interpreting the textual materials before him. And this reader creates a new book of Ezekiel and composes a bridge between major sections. And as he does this, we can see precisely what they found particularly salient and relevant, what captured his own theological imagination and hope for the future. And what does this reader / author / expander / editor of the Proto-Masoretic book of Ezekiel select to form a bridge between the two major sections of the book? It is precisely the hope for the spiritual transformation of the people, the heart surgery, the regeneration of God's people by God's own Spirit that this sacred author sees as of particular importance. What this author found so compelling and worthy of elaboration is the promise of Pentecost, the promise of baptismal regeneration. Our discussion this evening has brought to light a distinct moment in the inspired reading and expanding of the manuscript tradition of Ezekiel, in which these new covenant realities are anticipated with remarkable clarity. Thank you.